So thank you everyone for jumping on here. As a quick reminder, you are muted. Please use the Q&A box to be able to ask any of your questions as we go throughout this presentation. I'm super excited about the convo that we have today, mainly because I find it to be super interesting. And it's a conversation that I'm having with a ton of you, most assuming a lot of the manufacturers that are joining us today. And that is around different pricing models when we say the term hardware as a service. And this one specifically is around usage-based pricing. Which I believe, and Rotem, you'll certainly talk more about this as our expert on this webinar, is really something that hardware manufacturers are starting to learn or have learned from software providers. And I think it's an amazing evolution that we've seen in this industry that has really started to provide different go-to-market models around usage-based pricing for products that traditionally were always one-time sold. So that's going to be the big topic for today. A quick introduction for those that don't know who I am, but hopefully a couple of you have joined our webinar series over the last several months. My name's Andrew. I run our global sales team here at Excite. Excite is a all-in-one servitization platform for hardware manufacturers to really take your one-time sales products and turn them into recurring revenue opportunities, turn them into potentially usage-based pricing models you can go to market with. But enough about me. Our star of the show here is Rotem Shacham, who is the director at PSG Tel Aviv. And Rotem, two questions for you, actually, as you introduce yourself. Love for you to explain a little bit about what PSG is, but also what's kind of gotten you interested in usage-based pricing and made you an expert in this world.
For sure. So first of all, thanks, Andrew, for having me, and thank you all for joining. It's a true pleasure. Maybe briefly about PSG. PSG is a growth equity firm based out of Boston, been around for about 10 years, and we invest in growth stage companies, startups in the US, in Europe, and in Israel, in a variety of industries, verticals, and stages. And before that, I was actually a principal at Velo Ventures, which is an early stage startup. And prior to that, I spent many years as a management consultant working at BCG. And I think kind of over my career, especially at BCG, I noticed that large companies face a lot of challenges that relate to their business model, and many of those relate to pricing. And when I shifted towards the technology space, to early stage, and then to growth, it kind of revealed itself that, like, huge conglomerates, also growth stage and early stage startups face the same questions about business model, and pricing is a key component of that. And when you look at a lot of surveys that analyze why startups fail, one of the big reasons is misalignment of business model and pricing. And what I like about it, like the flip side of that, is that this is something that is totally within the grasp of management teams all around. So this is something we can change and improve our chances of success, which is what got me excited about pricing in general. And usage-based pricing, I think we'll talk about it later. It's been around for a long time in non-software, and in software more so in the past few years. And it struck me as a really important lever in aligning the value that the customer get with the value that the software or hardware provider can offer. And it's sort of like magic. It has a lot of components that create a win-win situation for everyone, which is something that gets me excited.
Yeah, I think that's so cool. I came from the hardware space myself, Rotem, and traditionally the thought process is always got to add a new feature, got to make a new version of that box to bring greater value to my customer. But sometimes pricing can actually be that value driver. And I think it's forgotten a lot about. In the software world, it's always thought about, but in the hardware space, it's typically forgotten about. So that's what makes me so excited about this conversation, because I think we're all grasping in the hardware manufacturing, device manufacturing space to add greater value to our products, to our customers, and of course, drive greater revenue and service and support for everyone. And this is something that I believe is going to really open their eyes to some new opportunities there. So what is the agenda for today? As Rotem mentioned, we're going to first kind of define what usage-based pricing really means. I'm sure you can make an assumption of what UBP means, but it actually has different applications in different ways that it can be implemented for different manufacturers. We're going to define it, kind of talk about how we got here and aligning on a couple different terminology aspects as it relates to usage-based pricing, because there is a difference between as a service, subscriptions, and usage-based pricing. So we're going to break that down for you. But also, of course, discuss why are we even talking about this now? What has brought us here today to decide this is a webinar that's important for us to review? Then we're going to talk about the benefits. What is the benefit for you as the implementer of usage-based pricing? And of course, what's the benefit for your channel and your customers? And then the how. How do we actually get started with this? If everything sounds cool and you actually want to do this tomorrow, what does it look like to take those steps to really getting to market with this type of pricing model? So to kick us off, Rotem, let's start with the stupid simple, but really something that's most important is, what is usage-based pricing? And I think one of the most interesting things about this definition is it isn't something new, right?
Spot on, spot on. So if we start with just a definition, and there are multiple definitions, but they're all centered around the premise that usage-based or consumption-based, depending on the word that you're using, is just a pricing model that charges customers based on what they use or what they consume. Based on the name, it's fairly easy. And I think now is a good time to distinguish, and many people kind of get them confused, between price and pricing. So price is how much, like how much do you pay for a certain product or a service, and pricing is how you price it, how you pay for it. So you can pay the same price, but through a different pricing mechanism. And the greatest value of usage-based pricing, sometimes it's called value-based pricing, is that it aligns the value that the customer pays with the price they pay. So the more value you get, the more you pay. The less you get, the less you pay. And it's really, and we'll get to it later on in the webinar, but that's kind of the key element. And as Andrew mentioned, it really isn't new. If we think about it, we pay for many utilities in our lives with the usage-based pricing mechanism. So water, we pay based on how much we consume, gas, electricity. Back in the day, for some communication forms, whether it's a telephone or other forms, we used to pay based on the consumption, so based on how much we use, and it changed. The reason why it changed, we'll come back to it later, is interesting because it relates to software as well. But all to say, this is not new. We're not making up anything. We're just taking from other industries and implementing in technology.
And if, I highlight one big thing on this slide too, because it's going to be a common theme throughout this conversation. And that's the second bullet there, is about aligning the incentives or aligning the value between the customer and the provider, whether it's a service, a hardware, whatever it may be. That is a very common theme I love to kind of bring up, and I'll mention it over and over again, because I think that's one of the most underlying benefits of usage-based pricing. We're going to talk a little bit about how this can be implemented or how it's realized throughout this conversation. So, but Rotem, what was the evolution? How did we kind of get to this usage-based pricing model from products to services to this variable product service?
Yeah, so this is sort of an evolution that we've seen over the past 20 years, I think, again, in technology. And this is talking from a software perspective, and we can later think about what are the differences or the commonalities with hardware. But if we think about how software was sold, and it doesn't matter if it's consumer-based, like Windows 95, or if we're talking about storage, or whatever element of the tech stack. At the beginning, it was sold as a one-off product. You bought Windows 95, you bought a license. It usually was a perpetual license, and you paid for it once you bought it, right? It was a one-time purchase. The reasons for it was that there was a very long development cycle. There were a lot of high costs in development. The distribution was usually not direct. So you would buy, again, whether it's storage or whether it's an application through channels, usually it required an on-prem installation, and the product usually was relevant for a long duration of time. Then probably 10 years ago, or after I think the innovation cycle that peaked in 08, 09, we started to see emergence of software as a service models that went hand in hand with subscription. So we paid for a certain duration, like if we take the example from the product, instead of buying storage from companies like Cisco. Now we're going to AWS, and we're paying based on cloud services. Or if we're buying from Microsoft, we're buying Office. Now we buy Office 365. We pay usually for 1 year. The reason why we can make this change is, first of all, the cloud revolution happened, so we can offer software as a service rather as a one-time installment. Development time were shortened. Our cost to deploy a new solution or a new software went down significantly, so we could do it over time. We could start using direct distribution rather through channels for distributors. We could offer both on-prem and cloud. And in general, the life cycle of the product became much, much shorter because technology advanced much faster. And then as these cloud solution improved, we saw more so in the last 5 years or so, the emergence of a variable service, which we call usage-based. And you see it a lot in databases. Snowflake is one of the greatest example of this. Now you pay based on they call it compute, how much you pay, and it doesn't matter. It's very different compared to the database, the SQL databases that we used 15 years ago, where we paid, no matter how much we used it. And the reason why why we see this emergence of pricing is because we see a technology advancement. Because of the cloud usage, now it's much easier for any software provider to know how much and to track how much a customer is using their product. And I'm specifically using the word using and not a specific metric because it changes based on the different products. But it allows for direct distribution. The development cycle is much shorter. We see a lot of emergence of a product-led growth, right? We don't need a very costly direct distribution. We see more and more kind of use it if you like it, then consume more. Because again, of two main kind of drivers. One, the companies know how much the customer is using. They can track it and they can price accordingly. And we see again this whole transition across everything from user applications. A good example of usage-based pricing is games, right? We pay based on tokens or how much we use, which is very different from just having an Office installed on our computer, all the way to databases and storage. AWS and Snowflake are just two examples. There are much more. So we saw this transition across all the stacks, and we'll later get to why it was done. But I think it's a good example because it can show what can happen in other industries, for instance, in hardware and things that are more closer to everyone on this call.
Yeah, so we're kind of in that third phase. And I think it's important also for those on the call to recognize that you may be thinking, well, I make a product, right? So does that mean I can never enter into this third phase of a variable service? And as we'll talk about later on, actually, that's not the case. Just because you currently sell your thing as a product, like you sell your refrigerator as a product, it does not mean that you can't transform that into a service or a variable service. We're going to talk a little bit about the how and the why and the tools to get you there. But in these three phases, right, if you take the refrigerator example, that was a product because maybe there's not a new refrigerator that's coming out for another 3 years. So that's the long dev time. Then we moved into the second phase of a pricing evolution in the service side, which was SaaS, right? Which allowed me to get these updates constantly, but I was paying a fee no matter how much I even logged into that platform. And finally, we have this alignment of incentives between the provider and the customer of I'm only paying for what I use, which got back into even the water or the electricity model, but now finally has entered this third phase of transforming previous one-time sales purchases into this variable service, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But I think one thing, Rotem, in terms of this next conversation or next slide, is a lot of people immediately think of that as a subscription, but there is a difference between these two, right?
Exactly. And on top of that, many people sort of kind of equate software as a service as simply subscription. which is kind of selling it short. So software as a service or something as a service is the business model, is what you provide and how you provide it. You can have two companies, both are SaaS. One is pricing as a subscription and one is pricing as a usage base. So again, it doesn't define your product or your service, it just defines how you're pricing it. So if we align on kind of what is these two pricing methodologies, subscription basically says that the customer pays a fixed, it's usually a recurring payment, right? That's why many software companies track themselves based on ARR, which is annual recurring revenue. It's usually tied to number of seats, like Zoom. Zoom usually charges its customers based on how many licenses you need, how many users. There are some flexibility in tiers. Sometimes it's based on features. You have a basic tier, you have a premium, sometimes you have an enterprise one, or sometimes it's based on scale, right? If you take so many seats, you would pay so and so for every seat. If you take more seats, I would charge you less per seat, so you get benefits of scale. And the most important thing is that the payment obligation from the customer to the provider is correlated with time. So you pay a certain amount for your license, and that license is relevant for usually 12 months. Now, usage-based is very different. First of all, the payment is variable. It's not fixed. It's tied to a certain metric of actual usage. So in storage, it's based on how many gigabytes, metabytes, or whatever metric of storage you're using. Snowflake databases, it's compute. You have companies where it's based on API calls, and there are really, really multiple types of metrics, and we'll talk about it a bit later. It's usually agnostic to number of users, which is super important because it's one of the benefits. It reduces friction and for adoption. Now, it can be linear. Linear means pay as you go. Think about a meter when you go into a taxi, and the farther it goes, the more you pay. Or it could be tiered based. What is tier based? Think about, arcades when we were little, and we go to the arcade and we say, hey, here's $10, and I get all these tags for how many games I can play. That's tier based, like a bank of credits. You can think about it. And the most important thing is that the payment obligation is correlated to your actual usage. And that actual usage is either the one that was metered, pay as you go, or either based on how many credits you bought, but the guiding principle is the same. You pay for what you use, not for just a certain amount of time that you're able to use, which is a very big difference between the two.
Yeah. And there's a key things here on the usage base, just to highlight further that you brought up. That's related to the metric of actual usage and payment obligation correlated with that telemetry, let's just say. And I think that kind of is a good transition into this sort of why now. And part of the why now is the fact of these more connected devices. I mentioned a refrigerator just a couple of minutes ago. Well, just 5-10 years ago, that refrigerator was not a connected device, meaning we weren't able to get telemetry back from that connected device. Or from that refrigerator. So now that a refrigerator may be a connected device, you can take a piece of telemetry and actually charge upon it. So there's almost this, not just of a market change, which we're going to talk about in a second, but also just simply a product shift that we've seen from manufacturers. As more connected devices are being sold, even the opportunity or the option to be able to offer it as a usage-based pricing model has started to open up because it's so much based upon this telemetry, so much based upon this metrics of being used. And what I've seen in working with these different manufacturers that are looking to implement usage-based pricing, it's actually bi-directional. And what I've noticed with that is, yes, the product itself needs to be able to communicate a telemetry of usage, and then the manufacturer will then charge based upon that usage. But there's actually a third step in that. It's also the verification of that charge. A lot of the manufacturers I'm working with, their customers have responded back to them as, yes, I totally want to be able to implement or be able to take part in a usage-based pricing, but I also want to verify that what I'm using and what I'm being paid on matches up. So it's also a subscription for usage-based pricing with also verification of the charge itself. So being able to go back and see how much I've used and compare it to the bill that I've had. And that can only be, possible, obviously, not just with the telemetry, but of course with greater platforms that allow for visualization of these different metrics. And so I think that kind of gets us to this why now with not just the product, as we just talked about, being implemented, has now been transitioned and digitally transformed into a more connected telemetry-driven device, but also the market and the demand of the consumers, both in B2C and B2B, looking and expecting this type of business model. And so as we talked about in the beginning, Rotem mentioned that we already pay for our electricity and our water on consumption-based models. But subscriptions and as a service business models have truly become a value driver over this last generation. I mean, even over just the last 20 years, we've seen since the inception of Salesforce, we've transitioned and consumed now most of our software as a service, from Adobe to Monday.com to SAP. But now finally infrastructure and platforms as a service. I think, Rotem, you mentioned Snowflake, but even, of course, AWS and Azure have moved into this transition. But now also we're seeing content, right? And that's something not to forget about. Content, things like Netflix, Spotify, Peloton classes have moved into this as a service and potentially usage-based pricing model. But the final frontier, which has been the big subject here, is really around hardware and devices. And we've seen a start in this world, right? Today you can buy coffee and tires and propulsion from Ansel, Rolls-Royce, or Michelin as a service. But the one main thing that hasn't followed just yet is, at least at large scale, is these device manufacturers. And so that's kind of where we've come from. And of course, Rotem, what you've seen is not just this transition of device and equipment and hardware manufacturers into this subscription world, but also into the usage-based world, because you have to have that telemetry-driven pricing model, which is now possible because there's platforms out there and customers driving for it. And those examples of some of those companies that we mentioned, from Rolls-Royce to Volvo to one very interesting one being Apple, actually, is Apple has started to implement this type of usage-based business model in the hardware as a service umbrella through things beyond just a pricing model, but in fact, something around what they call Apple Business Essentials, which is leveraging a platform to both deliver a usage-based pricing model to their B2B customers, but also service, support, and empowerment of their channel. And so this is just a great example, I believe, of one company identifying a clear market need or demand in wanting to consume services based upon what or how much they use, being able to scale properly across multiple customer bases, but then using that pricing model to not just implement a new pricing model, but drive greater value for themselves, drive greater value for their customers, but also a key component, their channel, to be able to do more with services and support in front of that pricing model, which really was around this Apple Business Essentials. So I think that's a great example. And I think this kind of gets us into, Rotem, another huge kind of conversation that we've been underlying throughout these different slides, which is that alignment of incentives, or that win-win, finally, for customers and vendors, and not just a company selling a product at a high price point to simply gain more revenue, but now being mutually invested in delivering a better product. So why don't you explain a little bit more about how they're able to align between customers and vendors?
Exactly, Andrew. And let's start first with the customer, right? We all should be customer obsessed. So let's make sure it works for the customer and then see how it can all work for all of us. But first of all, it aligns value and price, right? It's very clear, and we'll talk about how to do it. But basically, the customer should understand or should perceive that he's paying for value that is attributed. So he's the product or the service, doesn't matter, is creating some sort of value, and I'm paying in sort of a linear formula compared to that value. Number two is that it's agnostic to number of users. Again, one of the major frictions that the subscription model has created is a kind of a step change every time you increase the number of users. And sometimes the value from the product increases significantly the more people use it. But then you have kind of these conversations. Again, I know it from software mostly, but Hey, do we really need to have that extra license in the team? What is the value that we'll get from it? It costs us a lot of money. And once you switch to usage-based pricing, that eliminates it completely. First of all, it doesn't matter, the more people, the merrier. And there is really all of the discussion about who uses is just like, you should use it if it creates value. So the friction is really reduced. And I think that's one of the major accomplishment of this pricing methodology. The third one, which is equally as important, is it provides accessibility. What does that mean? Because you pay based on what you use, usually the initial cost is very low. So again, the friction where you need to decide, hey, do I really need it or not, reduces significantly, especially in B2B and enterprise businesses where the ticket for the product is very high, right? It's a completely different discussion in procurement, whether we have to approve now $100,000 contract with someone versus the initial, cost is just $5,000, and then we'll see if we get value from it. Remember value, the first point, then we can use it more. So the engagement with the customer is so much easier. Their ability to say yes initially increases significantly, and also their ability to expand later on is based on pure facts and not something your sales executive needs to kind of sell to the customer. The fourth point is that it supports agility. So sometimes even if the customer wants to pay that high ticket item, like they're willing to pay $100,000 because they see the value, especially in times like this with high volatility and uncertainty, they're like, I see the value, but what happens if my underlying business changes? I'm still kind of tied for the duration of the contract, right? Because subscription is based on a certain amount of time. The moment you switch to usage-based pricing, that friction or that risk is greatly reduced for the customer. Their commitment is low, meaning that their risk on their side is low, meaning that their likelihood of adoption goes up significantly. And as you see kind of the blue star at the bottom, it's especially more important in these downturns or kind of times of uncertainty that we are unfortunately in the midst of. So that's all from the customer side. As you see, the customer should be extremely happy. Now, why should all of us be happy? So first of all, it provides us as providers uncapped upside potential. So in the past, again, if I'm pricing based on units or based on subscription, like if my ticket size is $100,000, even if my customer uses it extensively and they gain so much value out of it, I'm capped at my annual contract value. I can't get more. Whereas now, if I move to usage-based pricing, the more the customer makes, the more I get. And the reason why it's fine is that the more the customer gets, the more value they get. So they get more value. I get to take part of that value, and we're all happier. As I said earlier, it makes adoption easier. So you would see metric like growth and expansion go up quite faster than other pricing methodologies. And the fourth point is that it expands our addressable market. For instance, if for some reason in the subscription model, some customers would not be able to enjoy our product because the initial sales price was too high, now they can start low and potentially stay low because that's the usage that we get. Now, it's not really cannibalization because in the past, they were not my customers because just because I need to average my price, if I'm pricing based on subscription, they could not, enjoy it. And the last thing, because of the reduced risks and the agility that it provides to the customer, it reduces my gross churn. So in times of downturn, where customers need to decide, do we really need this product or not? Now they can just down buy, which would be a downsell for us. But they would be ready to reaccelerate growth once their underlying business improves. So as you can see, all these points really align between our benefits and the customer benefits, and our incentives are much more intertwined versus other pricing methodologies.
So Rotem, I was going to hold this to the end, but I think it's a great question to kind of bring up now, since you mentioned it, and it really is around kind of a point that's on both sides here, and that is this, as you have here, accessibility and then expanding on my TAM. To me, that's like it's lowering the barrier of entry, right? Like I
Exactly.
can enter into new spaces. But a question to you is, do you see this happening, or do you even recommend implementing usage-based pricing in entering new markets? Or is it really about expanding the TAM in your existing market? Just address it, and by market, I mean almost even geographies potentially. Do you see a trend in businesses that you've worked with, or have any recommendations as it relates to utilizing usage-based when entering new spaces?
Definitely. I think the short answer is yes, especially in situation where education is needed, whether it's because it's a new player at a new geography, or whether it's because you're, for some reason, going into a blue ocean, or from whatever reason. In any situation where there's some friction for the customer to onboard to the platform, to the service, to the product, doesn't matter what, the ability to enter, to start low with full acknowledgement that once you use more, you would pay more, which is fine. Just the ability to enter at a low price really reduces the guard, especially when education is needed and when I'm not sure either the value of the product or whether I want to switch from a different product. Just it makes the decision of to try much more easier compared to other situations.
Got it. No, I love that. I think that makes a ton of sense, especially for companies that are looking to grow their business. Right? We talked about, do you just enter and create a new product, but also do you actually now enter a new market because you have this new pricing model? Could be another thing to add to your strategy. So I love that. So we talked a little bit about the examples of companies, bigger, larger, trend-setting companies that are doing this today. We're talking right now about the why, right? Why did they do it? Why should you consider it? Let's talk a little bit about the when. When does this actually make sense, and what are some considerations that I should have if I'm considering when to implement this pricing model?
Yeah, and it's important for me to say at the beginning, usage-based pricing is not, a silver bullet. It's not the right answer to all questions. It makes sense in certain situations. It doesn't make sense in other situations. So it's not, one size fits all. And before I'll say when it works, if it's important to note that beyond just the upside of the win-win situation that we described below, there are some challenges that are attributed to usage-based pricing. Mostly, it's variable, which creates a lot of variability for the different users in challenges and predictability. So if at the beginning it was very easy to predict either your cost as a customer or your revenue as a provider, it becomes more challenging. There are solutions, but again, I don't want to be like a wizard saying, "Hey, use this and all your problems will be gone." There are some challenges. So when is a good situation to consider adopting usage-based pricing? After a lot of conversations with many companies, I narrowed it down to three key components that you need to say yes to all to make sure that that you can even consider it. So the first thing is that there's a direct causal link between the service and the value. So it's quite easy for the customer to understand or to see that from using your product, you generate some sort of value. If the causal link is, I don't know, flimsy, let's say, it's a bad situation. So maybe let's take an example. Let's say, and again, I'm sorry, it would be from the software business, but let's say we have an app editing, an app that edits pictures for, for us consumers. Think of, like Photoshop, but for the rest of us. And I'm an influencer and I use it to edit my pictures, and then I upload them to some social platform. So the value that I get is usually kind of measured in likes, but it's hard to know if, because I'm using this editing tool, did I get more likes? Unknown. Maybe I'm kind of standing next to a celebrity and that's why I got more likes. So in this example, there's not a clear causal link. What's the second criteria? that there's a limited existence of other contributing factors, right? That we have one main factor that creates the value, and that is our product. Again, if I kind of go back to my photo editing app, there are many other factors to why I would get more links or to how much value I get from a specific photo. The last thing is that I can see, or I can attribute, a very significant impact of the specific service or product on the value generated. So not only that I can identify a causal link, that there aren't not a lot of other contributing factors, but that it creates a lot of impact. Again, in my photo editing app, it's hard to see kind of how impactful it is. Maybe I look a bit nicer, but it's hard to see how many more likes I got because of this. And these three key criteria we can see happening in three major categories. So one is transaction-based activities. And we have here two examples from the fintech world. Square, that we all know, or Stripe. Their pricing is based on how many transactions. And it's clear to understand, right? There's a causal link to, if you use Square, the more consumers you have, the more transaction you make, the greater value. You don't have other ways to pass that transaction or that to charge your customer, and there's a significant impact, right? You can expand your market. You don't have to use cash. Another category that we see a lot of usage-based pricing being used is when you have a result or output-based solutions. So I'll give a few from software, and then Andrew can talk a bit about more of these hardware companies. But you see it a lot in marketing and sales-based tools or activity optimization. So HubSpot for marketing is a great example. Zapier for automation is another great example. So based on how many texts I generated or based on how many emails I sent to my target audience, that's how much I would pay. So these are great examples out of software. And I think the last category is one of the bigger ones. It talks about companies that their resource or capacity is directly tied to the service that they provide. So we talked earlier about AWS and Snowflake. One of the reasons why they price based on usage is because their internal costs are tied to the usage of the customer. So the more storage I use on S3, the larger Amazon's cost base would be. So they obviously need to tie my price to what their gross margin. The same with Snowflake, right? The larger my database, the larger Snowflake's cost base would be, which is again why they tie it. And as Andrew, I'm sure you have many, many examples of hardware companies in these categories as well.
Yeah, no, I love that you set that stage with the software space because it's so prevalent, right? And it really, these hardware or equipment manufacturers, they're just starting to get into this space, but seeing massive gains from it. Just back to the results or output based. I mean, I think another great example that we're all kind of used to, especially in the professional world, is printers, right? Paper page, right? It's a very clear, defined output that has been delivered, and I'm paying for that page being printed for myself. And then resource capacity based, it's a little bit more difficult, at least from a hardware standpoint, but we are seeing it, and we have seen it, especially in the Rolls-Royce example of this power by the hour, is instead of owning that engine for the plane, you are paying by the amount of sort of thrust that the engine is producing, but it is related to the resource and the capacity of the thrust of which that engine can produce. So it does actually relate back towards that Snowflake example or that cloud example that you gave, Rotem, of it is directly linked between what I'm paying to what the capacity is allowed to provide that kind of value out to me as a customer. So we're seeing this today, right? And I think when we say the when does this make sense, it's not I don't fit in any of these categories, but it's finding which category that you're able to kind of fit your business into, especially as an equipment, device, or hardware manufacturer, defining what that transaction, that output, or their resource may be, and then ensuring that your pricing model and your value delivery is really provided appropriately around that specific transaction output or resource that you're giving to your customer. So that's the when. And I think the last sort of part of this, Rotem, is the how. You know, we hopefully we've convinced enough people on this call that this all makes sense. There's a great reason why people are doing it. Innovative companies are making money off of it. I'm aligning incentives. And me as a hardware or device manufacturer, you know, I figured out that transaction, that output of the capacity that my product provides. But how do I go about doing all this stuff?
Yeah, and I would start by saying, again, unfortunately, there is no kind of right answer. And usually the answer is to try, have an hypothesis, test it, and continue and iterate. In general, I think in pricing, iteration is kind of the best course of action. You can never get it right the first time. You should have an hypothesis of what should work, try it out, and then improve as you go. So what do you think when you're choosing or when you're thinking about what metric or how should I price? The first thing, and I think it goes without saying, it needs to be based on value. So the customer needs to understand that the metric that you're using or the count system is deeply aligned with the value that they're generating. So, for instance, you know, again, AWS, the more gigabyte, the more it's very easy to understand why is that the metric. Or in Snowflake, the level of compute. So how much I'm challenging, let's say, the database. The second element is that it needs to be attributed. So there needs to be, again, this causal link that we talked about between the metric and the value. The third one, and I can't stress this enough, it needs to be simple. So even if it's not the best metric, but it's simple to understand, it needs to be the way to go. The second one is that it's scalable, right? You need to choose a metric that grows as your customer uses it more. It needs to be predictable. This is mostly for the vendor, so you would be able to bill, but it also needs to be very predictable for the customer, right? Because I need to understand what my cost base is. And last but not least, it needs to be feasible. It needs to be feasible for the vendor to be able to monitor and to administer. And kind of if we go back maybe to the example Andrew just gave about Rolls-Royce and one of the earlier usage-based pricing in hardware, you can easily see that it aligns to all these metrics. And the reason why it was one of the earlier usage of this pricing mechanism in hardware is just because you had the data, right? It was very easy to track how much an engine was running because of special regulations in the aerospace industry. So this feasibility and the ability to know how much a customer is using and to be able to have the data to price it is like the first prerequisite to even do it. And in all of our examples, we can see that once that was available, these companies were able to deploy this pricing mechanism going forward.
Yeah, it's great, Rotem. And then is there anything else you wanted to go through related to choosing the right technology before we kind of wrap up this conversation?
I think we can go over this quickly. Again, I think it needs to match to the what we're focusing on in metric. It needs to be easily understood, easily monitored, automatic, to be like easy to track and to connect to your billing systems, easy for everyone to understand. So I think many of these points kind of goes without saying.
No, it does. And you know, I think that's a great way to kind of wrap up this discussion around easy or simple, right? These are like the common words I was hearing in the how. It can't be stressed enough, right? You know, in the form of if you make it complicated, then your customer's not going to want to adopt something new or different or unique that they weren't used to consuming your product previously on. And what that kind of gets me to is this concept of user flow or experience, or really just like even the interface on the back end, you as a manufacturer wanting to implement this type of usage-based pricing model. And of course, your channel and your end customers engaging in that pricing model. There must be a simple way to go about taking your thing, your equipment, your hardware, your device, your any type of sensor or a piece of hardware that you manufacture and turning it into a usage-based pricing model for your customers. And that's what gets me to this last little conversation, which is the platform or a platform to support you around this. And it is two ways. As I mentioned, it is you as the manufacturer having a platform that allows you to very easily implement, but also go back and iterate and scale this type of pricing model out to your customers in your channel, but also providing down to your customer the ability for them to first engage upfront in this new pricing model and then continue to engage to ideally what we talked about earlier on, which was the verification of that usage-based pricing model. So there's 6 main categories here that we've noticed in our long time in terms of partnering with hardware, device, and equipment manufacturers who have wanted to make this transition into usage-based pricing. There have been 6 key factors that have found success in when they made this transition. And it wasn't a company-wide transition, right? It was product verticals, maybe specific markets, maybe it was an option to consume that product as a usage-based pricing model to slow that transition. But it was enabling the pricing model initially. So instead of having to start from scratch, building internally, hiring big teams, providing tools to very easily go to market and quickly go to market and address that market by using these standard-based tools to deliver a usage-based pricing model. Partnering with someone who supported the full transaction. So if you are going to enter into new markets, as we talked about previously, you have to consider taxes and you have to consider transaction methods from POs to credit cards to, of course, currencies. We have on the bottom left is the ability to manage and monitor these different items. And it may sound that that's a separate benefit to all of this, but as we talked about in the beginning, this transition that we've seen from devices to now delivering telemetries through the cloud to be able to actually price upon, you now can leverage that telemetry to also monitor or manage that hardware. So provide greater value in addition to the usage-based pricing model itself, offering support to empower your channel partners, and of course, analyzing that performance, which gets back to that verification line of being able to truly see and verify what I'm being charged for. The last little thing to mention on here is about this remote customer support. You may be curious, or as a hardware manufacturer, how does this relate to usage-based pricing model? But I'll simplify it very down to one key factor is if you are going to enter into and you see value in entering into this pricing model of usage-based, well, usage-based will only drive value and only drive revenue for you if the product is working. That product isn't working and it can't be used, then you're not even able to generate any revenue from it. So support is massive. So ensuring that the product itself is extremely hardened and extremely reliable so that it's always using. But of course, if there is an issue, make sure that it's resolved properly. Make sure it's resolved quickly and remotely so that you can continue down generating revenue in that usage-based pricing model. So don't forget about support. It's a massive part of entering into this pricing model. So with that, I do want to jump. We have a couple quick minutes, and we actually got some questions here. I got one quick question I'll just address briefly. Somebody asked about sharing the slide deck. Absolutely. We will share that with anybody who has joined and those that have signed up. We'll share this slide deck as well as the recording. But Rotem, I did have a couple questions for you here that came in. One of them was mainly around the operational challenges. And the question was, what are some operational challenges that companies who are looking to implement usage-based pricing, what should they look out for? Any things that maybe you've seen with companies you've worked for, or just general recommendations you may have?
Yeah, definitely. And as I mentioned, it's not the right solution for everyone. And once you deploy it, there are some kind of growing pains. I think the first one, and we covered it significantly here, is just the monitoring and the ability to know how much the customer is using and the ability to bill accordingly. So it's finance needs to be using the right tools and the right platforms for billing. The next thing is actually about the go-to-market. There needs to be, and there are solutions for that, but you need to rethink how the sales compensation work to make sure that the sales compensation is aligned with company incentives and with customer incentives. That's another big thing. And the second thing is, the third thing is about kind of budgeting and projecting and understanding where is our trend line and forecasting the future. This is another thing that takes some time because you need to understand really the variability in usage to be able to predict accordingly.
Awesome. So I think we have time for 2 more questions. Another one for you, Rotem. The question came up around in terms of pricing approaches, when does a pure usage-based pricing model make sense versus a hybrid approach? Right? Do I need to go all in, or can I actually provide options or a combination between usage and fixed models?
Actually, what I've seen is in most cases, it doesn't matter where companies start, they end up with having a combination of both, and it depends usually on the type of the customer. So many times SMBs or smaller companies, they prefer kind of pay as you go or the more kind of linear version, whereas large enterprises, they want a bit more predictability. So they often opt for the tier version. That's one reason why we see both system deployed. And the second one is that pay as you go is usually a great lever for managing your funnel. So to bring potential customers from the pilot phase to kind of being fully onboarded, instead of offering like a freemium or kind of a POC or a shorter contract, what we see many times is having this pay-as-you-go model as a lever to bring customers from the I'm not sure I need this or I'm not sure how much I need to kind of fully onboarded. Let's move to more like an enterprise type deal where we see more and more the tiered version of usage-based pricing.
I see. Thank you for that, Rotem. Last question was around the commercialization tools and the technology to deliver this. I'll take this one briefly. So this last slide that we brought up here to answer this question related to technology is, if you are interested in if our conversation today resonated with you at all in terms of implementing usage-based pricing models, can you go out and do this tomorrow with what you have, in-house? Maybe you could build your own tool and a platform and deliver it. Where we were coming from and what Excite partners with manufacturers on is to provide a standards-based platform, the tools to build this a lot quicker and a lot lower cost and a lot easier, and keep it simple. As Rotem mentioned, one of the biggest things you can do properly in this how to implement usage-based pricing is to keep it simple and easy for you and your customers. Do not make it complicated for them to adopt these new models. And that's where we're coming at this. We want to make it simple and easy for you as a hardware manufacturer to implement and deploy usage-based pricing model, but also, of course, simple and easy for your customers to engage, and not just to click the button, but also to verify their payment, to see their products, and of course, as we talked about, engage in support so that they are being used, and you can then, of course, price appropriately around your different products. So thank you for that last question. To wrap this all up, Rotem, if anybody wanted to find out more about PSG or maybe connect with you directly, where should the folks go after this webinar?
You can either go to our website or reach out directly through me through LinkedIn, whichever one that you choose.
Awesome. All right. And same with us. If anyone wants to find out more about Excite, please go to www.excite.io and you can find tons of information there. You can also request a demo to see our platform. And of course, if you guys would like to engage with me, feel free to find me on LinkedIn as well. It's just LinkedIn at Andrew P. Gross. Feel free to DM me there. Be happy to talk to you more about usage-based pricing. And of course, all the other things that we can implement together as partners. So Rotem, thank you so much for today. It was an incredible conversation. Your insight was amazing. Hopefully those on the call gained a lot of great information on the how, the when, the why to actually implement usage-based pricing. And for those that attended, thank you all so much for your time. As I mentioned, this PowerPoint and the recording will be shared afterwards. And of course, if you wanted to engage with ourselves here at Excite or with PSG to learn more about usage-based pricing or just in general about transforming your business to generate more revenue or recurring revenue, we would love to work with you all. Thank you guys all again. Have a great day. And Rotem, thank you as well again. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.